All right, Mo, we have Lisa, as she likes to be called, with us today. And I'm so excited, Lisa, to get into your story and your background and what you're doing. Like I said, I'm not going to do the whole preamble, but I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So we'll go a little bit of back and forth. Can you talk about who you are, what you do, and then we're going to get into how you grew up?
Okay. So Lisa Wobbe-Veit. I hold multiple hats in my professional world. I'm a mom and a wife, so those are some parts that kind of ground me as in the work that I do. I'm a professor at the University of Southern California, Suzanne Dwork Peck School of Social Work. I'm an administrator, assistant director for practicum, so supporting students as they develop and build their clinical hours towards their Master of Social Work. I work as a national trainer in a training center and a consultant through the Center for Safe and Resilient Schools and Workplaces. I've worked there as a trainer since prior to 2018. Many of my colleagues, before even that center came to be, we've worked together for quite some time on school-based work. And then for the past 7.5 years, I have been the long-term family liaison for families that were most impacted by the Marjory Stoneman Douglas shooting. So working with families whose loved ones were murdered in the building and injured survivors and their families.
Can you talk about your upbringing?
Sure. I'm the eldest of 3 girls, born and raised outside in a small town outside of St. Louis, Missouri. Parents are actually just leaving on a magical trip for my mom's 75th birthday.
Awesome. Yeah.
They are doing 2 river cruises in Europe. So I have
nice.
My parents married for 50-something years, actually, because I'm older than that.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you don't hear about that a lot.
Nope. Grandparents were married, most aunts and uncles. Definitely a very close-knit. I grew up in a Catholic, religious school.
Okay.
Through 8th grade, went to public high school. Very supportive family. Went to the University of Missouri-Columbia thinking I was going to become a veterinarian. I always had a love of animals. A lot of rescuing of animals. We had many animals that would show up on our doorstep that my parents were not so pleased about.
No idea.
And realized very soon that I don't love chemistry and you need 32 hours of just beginning chemistry to become a veterinarian, and really started to explore what my interests were. And it was always around supporting and helping people. And so I ended up working as getting my degree in human development and family studies with an emphasis in child life therapy. And that was working with children in hospitals regarding their really processing and coping with their medical care. So sometimes pain management. I worked at St. Louis Children's Hospital as an intern and working within the HIV community. So that was I worked in burns and I worked in cancer. And so it was.
Now, was that something that you were drawn to?
I was always.
Because I think a lot of people maybe want to not do that, but were you drawn to that?
I was always drawn to supporting youth. Even in my more, as I've grown in my profession, I've always had a focus on youth. I've always had a passion for working with children and really understanding that, it's a holistic environment in which shapes a human and what some of their needs are. So I loved that work. And it was through that work that I became interested in social work, not because I didn't want to become a child life specialist, but because I was going to marry someone who moved a lot for work. And the reality is child life specialists, they're only in large children's hospitals. And if you're not in a large city and, once you have a job, moving around was not really so much an option. I decided, learned a lot about social work as a hospital social worker and decided that was going to be my next path. And I stayed within hospitals, in school, working once again as a social worker at St. Louis Children's Hospitals, and married my husband the weekend after I graduated graduate school. And you know what? When you move 1,000 miles away, you can't get started in a hospital. You have to work towards licensure and, you have to have connections. And I started working as an outpatient therapist in a large nonprofit mental health provider. And I was working in schools. And my first school that I was placed in was at the time I came, it was like 72% free and reduced lunch, 100% minority school.
Wow. Where was this at?
It was in Orlando, Florida.
Okay. Yep.
And by the time through the work that we did, we were up to 92% free and 92% free and reduced lunch school.
Yeah.
And the first day of my first day of work, the principal came in. I was introduced as like, this is going to be your outpatient therapist. And they looked and said, what do you know about Black children? Do we have a choice? Because I was a very young time. I was 24 years old.
Yeah.
And it took about 30 days, but over the next many years, I did the work. And the principal not only became a believer in the work, but hired me because I was an outside provider coming in and said, wait a second, you can only see children on, that have funding either through, Medicaid or through a service provider. I want you to be a full-time social worker at our school so that you could work with any child in our program as long as we had permissions. And so that is where my connection to schools began.
Yeah.
Once I did that work, I was hooked, and I spent the next 10 years I worked for many years there, and then I transferred at the age where I started to have kids, I moved to an older age group because I always felt like that was a good balance for me, is to not be working with the same population as I was raising at the time. And so I went to work at a contract school for students who had behavioral and other challenges, working with a 75% juvenile justice affiliated population.
What age group was that?
So Orlando, my first position in schools for like the first 4 years was a K-5 school.
Okay.
Yeah. And then I moved into a alternative middle and high school. That
was the contract school, the second one?
Yes.
All right. So back to the K-5, because this is crazy, because maybe I'm too old now, but you weren't allowed to see kids that didn't have certain insurances or whatever. You weren't.
So So districts have relationships with outside service providers that can come into the school and provide services.
Yeah.
And so I was one of those providers. But to receive those services, it was through various funding sources, whether it be Medicaid or a grant-funded program. So you had to qualify for the services. And you would think 92% free and reduced lunch. Shouldn't everyone qualify for services?
Yeah.
And the answer is yes, if they had the resources or the understanding of how to be connected to service.
See.
And so you often have families who grandparents are raising children due to incarceration or other avenues where it was the village raising and supporting, but maybe not having all the resources to support or provide. At the time, did I think about undocumented? I didn't. But, many of those students, as I went into middle and high, may have been undocumented. There's reasons why students don't receive service for many reasons. Just as we learned to receive free and reduced lunch in our public school system, you have to fill out a form.
Yeah.
Well, you have to fill out that form accurately, number one. Number two, you have to be able to read and complete the form. So what we did is anyone who didn't have a form, I went door to door to help support families. And we realized 20% of the families just didn't know, didn't turn in, or didn't complete it accurately because of the challenges within the home. And so I came from a perspective of, I don't want to make anyone feel in any way lesser than. I'd say, let's go over this form together.
Yeah.
And I'd start reading the form. And if they could continue the reading on their own, then I would stop. But if they didn't join in with me, I would go through the home form together because they didn't need to tell me they didn't know it. They couldn't read it.
Yeah.
They didn't understand it. It was, how do we meet people where they are and be that support? And so that's kind of where I began. So part of it was like working in the mental health, supportive behavioral health side. And the other was, how do we meet people where they are and trust school and the school and school relationships and coming into school? Because you don't come into school when you yourself didn't have a good relationship with your school as,
for sure. What's kind of, I don't remember paying for lunch when I was in elementary school. So, but maybe I did, or I don't know, but I thought that was a given. So that's a little, just my ignorance. But what you're talking about is, I have changed my views because I have two children. My son is 19, my daughter's 17. And it's always been like I've been heavily involved in their education as much as I can. But what I'll say is, as far as like what you're describing, people who can't read, I mean, not to brag, but I don't think it matters. I have a master's degree, but I wouldn't read every single thing the school sent. And I'm sure I missed some things.
Mm-hmm.
But something as imperative as what you're talking about to make sure your kids can eat and get services that you provide, it's just like, this is where I start to waffle with sometimes like what you did. The school, you on your own, I guess, not the school, said, hey, I'm going to insert myself and be like, are you sure? Do you know all the things that are available to you? And I mean, I think that's huge. It's blowing my mind a little bit that you had a 20% increase in what, your first year, you said?
Yes.
That's
and
wild.
It was the principal who had a vision of how.
So the principal was backing you.
The principal is the one who said, "Come work."
Full support.
The first couple of years was a provider. I'm in the school for 2 years, and then when I was considering like my options of what I wanted to do,
yeah,
and I shared with the principal, that obviously I was in a starter position, so to speak, and she's like, I really would like you to come work for me.
Yeah.
Full time as a district employee. And it's pretty uncommon for there to be a social worker to be solely at one school. Oftentimes school districts, they don't have the funding to have like a one-on-one. So you might have, as school social worker, multiple schools, up to 5 schools. So you're there 1 day a week. I was exclusively at that school 5 days a week, addressing all of the needs that the school had, both from a behavioral mental health, a social emotional learning, and working with families, and really trying to change the culture of where a school is a community where you can come together. Most of the families, it was truly a community and neighborhood school where everybody lived around that community.
Yeah, that's amazing. Mo, go ahead. I can see it's on your lips.
So there was, like you said, she's putting out a lot of information that it's just...
I know, it's good. I'm like, whoa, I'm writing it down.
The one thing that I have a question, you said when you first came to that school, it was almost 100% minorities. And
it was 100% minority.
And the first question, obviously, they made a judgment off of your looks. Can you do this? With you being new in this profession and trying to kind of spread your wings, was that something that drove you a little bit more? Did you get offended by that comment? Did you understand where it came from? Can you share a little bit about your thoughts during that time?
I understood where it came from because I think it was, when you're thinking of young children, your comfort area is around what you're exposed to, who you know. And I might have been, I don't know if you're familiar with Orlando. I know Mo, so I don't know. Like I've worked off of Ivy Lane. So it
Very
was
much so. Yeah.
A depressed area of Orlando. And, there wasn't a lot of, I will tell you, I got pulled over many times going to work.
Oh, yeah.
Because they would say, ma'am, do you know where you are? And I'm like, yes, I work here. I always take every situation as an opportunity for learning for myself and for an experience to learn about someone else's belief system, who they came from, where they came from. No matter if I'm doing it for work, if I'm going on vacation, I want to learn about the people, where they live, and what their comfort level and understanding is. So I kind of took it from that way, knowing that, listen, I look very different from a majority of all of the students and actually most of the faculty and staff. And so I said, I understand that they didn't have an option of who they were getting. And I said, we can work together and all we can do is start from the beginning and try working together. And what I don't know, I'm willing to learn.
I see.
And so coming from that component, being present, and initially that was a fee for service kind of job. So I wasn't a salaried employee. It was a fee for service in that each hour that I was with the child, it was paid. The hours that I was not with the child was not paid. So documentation, all of those other kind of components were unpaid. And I've always been if you're not present, if you're not visible and people don't know who you are, you're not going to develop relationship. You're not going to develop community. You're not going to be a part of the system. And so I spent the first 30 days, maybe only 50% of the time with students because they came with, you had to have a number of referrals to get a full-time person. And you had to build the rest of your caseload.
Got it.
And so I spent most of my time out in the office, greeting parents, out at the bus. If you're not present where the people are, they won't be comfortable with you.
Yeah.
They're not going to be sharing
Yeah.
Yeah.
what I'm going to be asking.
Yeah.
Because to become a client, you had to do a full psychosocial history. You're sharing your life. And it was also realizing that not all cultures believe that someone else can come in, especially someone that looks like me, to work and work cohesively.
Yeah.
So I knew that I had to come from a place of learning and let it be a relationship that grew.
Yeah.
And if I was going to be successful, I had to start there.
Yeah.
And I had to be the one I'm always hesitant when people come in that they know too much. Because I'm always like, you need to be humble and say, I really don't know anything and you are the expert in this environment.
Right.
And so I'm going to learn from you. And that's kind of how I start.
Yeah.
And it was very successful.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mo. You got another one?
Yeah, to me, I was like, I wanted to hit on that because that's something that I know part of the reason I became a cop is because we didn't see a lot of cops that looked like me. And I know that that's one of the things that like we've got to bridge our communities with making them open to have people that don't necessarily look like them, but having them be able to receive whatever it is that these individuals have to offer. But it comes with, I think, like what you said, listening to you talk about going out and meeting the parents and going to the bus loops and things like that. That is huge. The community that I live in now, we have a mixed population at the elementary school that my son goes to, but we have, I know for sure, some people who are probably undocumented. We have some minorities, but we also have a mix because it's also out kind of in the rural area. And when you were discussing about not filling out the documentation, when we first started, it was considered a Title I school. So they got a lot of funding for different things. But fast forward a year later, we had parents that didn't complete the forms. And now hearing you say that, I wonder if it was due to them not understanding, not knowing, something like that, and it taking that more personalized touch with those individuals, or just letting them know, listen, you're safe to give us this information without worrying about repercussions, when you're talking about undocumented individuals and stuff. So do you think now that we are moving to a better place where people know the services that are being offered and they are more apt to take advantage of them?
I think it depends on where you are in this country, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think it depends on district by district, how many resources are funded in regards to services, because the average recommended social work ratio, I think, is one social worker to 250 students. That is not at all. I think our national average might be closer to 1 to 600, if not more. And there are some districts or places that don't have social workers or individuals that can handle the one-to-one because that role becomes, something that the school has to fill. And while it's as a social worker, first of all, you have to get over the misconception that as a social worker, many people think we're there to disrupt the family unit.
I was going to say the stigma, because working with law enforcement, whenever social services was with you, people got freaked out. So
one, it was like, breaking through the stigma and the education that really were there to help support and provide wraparound service. We're there to help lift up. I come from a very strength space or focus is like, let's find what you are all doing well and your family unit has together. And then how can we wrap around the things that you need to have more success or to have reduced stress or to even be knowledgeable about what you can and may not do because that might not have been your experience or your exposure. I have been very, very fortunate as a school social worker. In the 10 years that I was a school social worker, I was always working with an administration that believed in what I did, believed in the role, and let us build a network of supports that looked different
That's huge.
From other school environments. And that was very true of the principal that ended up hiring me from where I was to the alternative school.
That's huge.
And, it started, I was hired on as a behavioral specialist. And in the time that I worked there, started an intern program, housed 10 to 15 interns a year that serviced 253 students that didn't have mental health funding or services. So when you really think of but that was a vision that they were going to create basically what is a wellness or support center within the school. Because when students are in school and they want to come to school for whatever their purpose is, they're able to receive service and to be present. So like, for example, for that program, 75% of the students were juvenile justice affiliated. So we would run groups that they would, one, have to pay for outside. That was required for their probation. And so guess what? They came to school, they got their free mental health group, and we would develop groups around, what the judges were writing the orders for, impulse control, so we really worked to help service the community. And we had students who actually wanted to come to school, even though it was a school that was an alternative school. I mean, it was back, I worked there from 2002. So it goes back to 2007. And, they were wearing a uniform. They could not bring book bags. They went through a metal detector and a full pat-down search. So that
Good
was
way to start your day.
That's how you start your day. But where I was standing with the students when they were doing that? Yeah. Outside. If it was raining, if it was sunny, whatever, while they were waiting for that process, I was not taking part because I believed in that separation, but I was greeting them. I was talking to them. I was developing a relationship. And actually, it wasn't always the students that I worked with for the longest amount of time or individually in a clinical perspective. It was sometimes those students 5 years later, 4 years later, would come and bring their diploma. They would introduce me to their children, because it was sometimes not what I did. It was where I was and that I was present and a friendly face to say, hello, how's your day? Learned a little bit about music. I listened to shows that, so there was a relationship and a connection. Because without relationship or connection, there's not going to be trust, especially at the time when a majority of the families that I worked with looked different from me.
Yeah.
So I needed to come to a place where they felt that they were heard. And most people, that's really what they want, is they wanted to feel heard, noticed, listened to. And what I wish I would have known now that I didn't think about, because, as a clinician, we had to diagnose and whatever. And I didn't really understand. And it really wasn't something that was taught as much, as how much trauma impacts our brain and how we relate to the world and how we respond. And so I would say I did excellent work, but if there was something that I could take back today, is to know more about how I could have been more impactful, not just to look at, the symptoms that equaled a diagnosis, but what happened that led to the symptoms that lead to a diagnosis, instead of like, what's wrong with you? What happened to you that would cause this level of reaction? And so I think I did probably the best I could at the time with my knowledge base. I just think I know a lot more now that, and it's one of the reasons why I'm, as an educator, very much wanting to prepare social workers, especially as they enter into school positions, on all of the pieces that I wish I would have known as a social worker going into the practice versus, learning so much of it after.
Right.
Yeah, let me ask you this, because you're describing, you had to deal with, like you said, you're creating diagnoses, you're dealing with a vast array of different cultures, upbringings, trauma, different variety of students, some with some criminal background or whatever, got themselves in trouble, all these things. And on top of that, you're trying to work within a school administration, you're dealing with law enforcement, judges, whatever, orders. And then on top of that, you have to know of all the services that are, and then also all the paperwork and how to get them. Did they teach you all of that when you were getting your education, or is that something you had to kind of learn on the job? Because that seems like a 12-year program.
The concepts of social worker is that holistic. So you're looking at person of environment and starting where that person is. So yes, you have to learn. I was educated in another state. So of course, when I moved to Florida, I had to learn all about all of the resources, but knowing what is potentially out there is how you get started. And then you make those connections. And I used to tell my students, like, even when they came, is don't just learn about it, go visit. So I would actually have my students go visit the resources. So you could provide a dialogue, a visual, when you're sharing with families, like, this is what you do, because you also want to engage them in the process. I really believe that we're trying to help someone. I don't want them to be reliant on me. I want them to learn that these are your strengths, these are the things, and we're going to work together on building some of this. But it helps to be able to share, this is what you can expect when you go somewhere. When you help minimize the distress of the process. And I think of like the last time I tried to go to the DMV, or even trying to get a DMV appointment, like how difficult. And if you live in Monos in Florida, I mean,
oh yeah,
it's not even a human possibility right now, but how difficult the process. And I have resources and this, like I have all the skills and the exposure, and I've done it before because I have, myself, my husband, my two older children, so when I was doing it for my younger, I had that experience and exposure to know what it looks like. But it's always nice the first time you go somewhere to kind of know what you're stepping into. Yeah.
No,
I don't believe in surprises for people. I think if I can reduce the amount of surprise, give a little bit of idea of what to expect, I might reduce the frustration or the feeling like, why is this so difficult for me, when it's really just, it's a difficult process. Right. And so trying to normalize some of those actions and those steps so that they have more preparation on what to expect versus that, okay, this is too hard and giving up. Like, we might have to go back a couple times. We're not always successful the first time. I'm not successful for the first time. So I just really believe in trying to provide that holistic perspective. And I do think that social work education helps you look at the whole person.
Yeah.
And person in an environment and where we need to begin. And that's where that person is. And because each person is different.
Yeah, two things, and then I want to move on because we got a lot to get to, but you touched on two things. One, you must have the patience of a saint, because just what you're talking about, me just doing it in my own life, for me, my rage gets up to here sometimes. I couldn't imagine trying to do this day in and day out for other people. And then number two, and I just want to dive into this for a second, you talked about being raised by grandparents. There's a lot of people that happened to, and I, for a short stint, was raised by my grandparents. Now that I'm older, they're dealing with their medications, their doctor visits. Usually they're retired. They're in their second or third, whatever phase of life. And now they're raising a young child. And again, when they went to school, how much has changed. So it's what you're describing is, to me, it's painting a clearer picture. It could be very overwhelming for somebody in their 60s, 70s trying to get their grandson or daughter into school, and then all the forms, and raising a child is very expensive, especially if they have extra needs. I don't know how to phrase that correctly, but
you think about it.
Needs that you can't provide, right?
Exactly. Like when the first thing they ask for you, they want a social security number, their birth certificate. If you're a grandparent, you might not have any of that. Like,
That's
how
true.
do you get started?
Yeah,
and then
true.
What is the process? So when you really look at what some of the challenges someone has to overcome, it really is like, how do we meet them where they are to be able to even start out with the first step? Because it is very overwhelming. And I would say there was a large percentage of families that were either multi-generational or lived multi-generationally, or the parents might have been in and out of the home for different reasons, some because of incarceration or drug use or other things, and they're trying to keep the household together, and also trying to support children. And that's, I've always had children as the foundation, because my patience comes from them realizing that they don't have a choice. They're in this situation that they didn't get to pick. And so what can I do to help build that resource around them whenever possible? And so it was always, I guess that's where I started.
No, for sure.
And I've always taken that step. And I believe that any social worker you talk to will often say, these are the steps that we take when we start meeting with someone. Because if I don't build a rapport in a relationship, I'm never, that person might not come back in the door, or they might not let me back in the door.
Yeah, I think every social worker I've ever worked with professionally, they usually had a niche, or, they had at least when they were working with me, they had their one focus. So I kind of knew what that was. What you're describing to me is
broad.
Much different. It's much more broad, way broader than I didn't, to be honest, my ignorance, I didn't realize you dealt with all of that. Figured it was kind of piecemeal, but we'll move on for that. Mo, before we move on, anything?
No, go ahead.
All right. Sorry. Because I could talk to you about this for hours, because now I'm like, you're getting my mind going. So from the the contract school, what was the next phase?
I became a professor an instructor at the University of Central Florida
What year
in
was
their
that?
graduate school of social work.
What year was that?
That was in 2007.
All right, because I want to jump. I don't want to jump, but I want to lead into, because you told me before that you had been teaching virtually since 2011 before it was a thing, and I do want to talk about that. But so you have taught in-person classes, I guess.
I call it brick and mortar and in the cloud. So I've taught it. I taught at a brick and mortar university for 4 years.
Okay.
And that was, I probably never would have left the school, but I had 3 children under the age of 4 and a husband that was,
Oof.
I will say, he works in commercial construction and was in another city.
Yeah.
And so I was essentially a single mom Monday through Friday while he was working. And so I let the university know that I was leaving my position at the school, because with love, social workers, we don't do it for the money. And 3 children, 4 and under in childcare was more than I actually made in a year. And so I said I couldn't take students the next year because I, often supervise students from 3 different universities in the area around counseling and support.
Jeez,
and so they said, well, how about coming and teaching some classes for us? And I was like, I don't know about that. I don't like public speaking. And I went away to vacation and I came back and she's like, I put you on the schedule. And that's how I got started.
And I mean, did you love the aspect of teaching? Because I would assume it's got to be different than what you were doing.
It was a couple of things. I was able to kid share. So another professor had a child about a year older than mine. So I watched her child while she was teaching and she watched mine while we were teaching. So it was kind of the, how social workers come together and the mind and the brain of how to make things feasibly work. So I enjoyed.
Solvers. I'm just hearing problem solving. That's all I'm hearing. And I
always
love
a problem solving.
I love it.
And so I enjoyed that flexibility to be, with my family. But I also learned, I can help one person at a time, or let's say my caseload was 30. But when I was supervising students and I had 15 of them, and let's say they all had 10 clients, 250, so you are able, no, that's 150. Got to do it.
We don't do math on this show. It's all good.
So, so it was really on the impact and taking what I was able to learn in the time that I've had and wanting to utilize to build that impact, because there needs to be a lot more of us doing this work to support and to support communities or organizations. I don't always look at it's like a one-on-one. You might be changing policy or, it's however you're utilizing your skill set. But I was able to develop that skill set of supporting students out there doing the work. And so I always say practicum education, that's the I don't have a doctorate, so it's where I fit the best in a university setting. But it's also where the experience and the doing the work has a really big impact, because I'm talking to students who are also going out and doing their clinical hours in communities. And it's where the rubber hits the road. It's where you're getting to take what you've learned in school, the theory and all the skill, and actually try it out and learn that, yes, some of it looks exactly like a textbook, but most of it doesn't. Yeah. And what are the modifications and being creative and being a problem solver? And how do we work within systems that have limited resources or space?
Yeah. Also
My
true.
first office was a janitor's closet, and I'm not kidding, for years.
I believe you.
Logistical issues.
Yeah, you're touching on something that I struggle with a little bit is, do you need education over experience, right? And again, I'm not knocking PhDs or doctorates by any stretch, but you could be a doctorate and you've gone through school for 10 years, or, hey, I've had 20 years of experience. I don't know, right? But we'll just leave that where it is. Mo, anything on that? Because she told me a funny story about when she started teaching virtually, and I want to touch on it.
Oh, well, let's hear it, because I did some virtual teaching too, so I'm curious.
Lisa, I'll let you set it up. But wait, and I'm sorry, was there anything in between the brick and mortar to the cloud, or is that how you transitioned?
So I worked for 4 years brick and mortar, and USC was the first, University of Southern California was the first graduate school of social work to open a virtual platform. And if you would have asked me, and now I have to go back because I've been there 15 years, 18 years ago, to say, can you teach social work over a computer? My answer would have been no, not a chance. USC has, and still is to this day, all synchronous. So yes, our students do asynchronous work, but when you sign up for class, one of the reasons why we're doing this on a Tuesday, I teach Monday and I teach Wednesday. And when I have a 2-hour or 3-hour class, everyone logs on. We are our Hollywood Squares, as I call it. That ages me a lot because some people look at me when they say Hollywood
I know
Squares.
what you're
They
talking
don't know
about.
what I'm talking about.
I know what you're talking about too. I'm still in that bracket.
And we are, for all intents and purposes, a class in squares. And I've learned over time, we're smaller in size. My classes are smaller, 13 or under. So it was different in that the students couldn't hide behind, when you have a classroom of 25, 30 students, there's only so much time that people can, share and dialogue. So that was one. It's a much smaller format. And number two, because we do some of the work asynchronously, what students had done and had not done prior to class, and we are an adult learning platform. So you're supposed to come prepared. Mm-hmm. So I could see if a student had done the work and had watched the videos and how long they had been on the videos. Students would know, I will call on you if you had not done it. So they come prepared to really dialogue about what we were learning and really process because, I believe in meeting everybody's neurodiverse needs as an educator and really looking at how do we process through what we read and learn. And so, the only thing I can't see is arms at the ends of the extremities, so to speak.
We're talking about when you started, it was under Adobe. So sometimes the voice would go and then you'd see the mouth move. So it was a little pixelated.
Our first platform was Adobe. And think about virtual, like Zoom 15 years ago.
Yeah.
You would see people and their mouths would move, but their voice would start. It wasn't synchronized. It's like when you're watching a, something on TV and they have the voiceover wrong and it really frustrates you. Yeah. So at the beginning, it was like that. So I would know every student by their voice versus who was talking on the screen. So if a student could call me, I could say their name without did we have caller ID back then? Even know. I think I got a cell phone around then. I don't think I had a cell phone I got a cell phone in 2002, I think. So when you really kind of think about it, how much technology has taken, it's really very different. So in the beginning, you learn. So I learned how to teach virtually, how to make a classroom move when we're not touching or seeing each other, how to develop relationship through the cloud versus seeing someone across the way. Now, I often will try to meet my students, whether it be at graduation or if I'm in a community, I will say, I'm going to be in the area. You want to come meet me? And I'll forget sometimes that first time I've ever seen them in person. I worked with a colleague of mine for 3 years. 3 years. We were presenting at a conference together. It's expensive to do those things. We sometimes have to do it out of our own pockets. So we were sharing a hotel room and we were in the hotel room a day. And I was like, this is the first time we've met in person. It hadn't even crossed my mind that we had never shared physical space with someone. The first time I went out to work at USC, I'd been working with one of my colleagues for at least a year and a half. She walked up to me. She introduced herself. I'm, Ruth, And I'm like, I go, Ruth, it's Lisa. She's like, what? I go, Lisa Wobbe-Veit? She goes, you're blonde. I go, you need a better computer screen.
You need to change the settings.
She was seeing me for all these years as blonde. And I'm literally back then, the old age of my hair is lightning, but I've, fire engine red hair. Yeah. So I was like, but other than that, I just learned how to accommodate for whatever environment that you're in, because we're always going to have some deficits wherever we are. And for me, I can't see that sometimes your full arms. I talk with my hands a lot. I learned how to not talk so much. I learned how to not move so much in a space because it makes people dizzy.
Oh, yeah.
So when you are working with someone who's just learning how to do some of those things, you change over time because I sometimes watch myself back. We videotaped our classes. That's very painful. And you're like, why did I say that? Or why did I do that? So, so I try not to move so much. I'm a big face talker and a hand talker. I try not to do so much of that because it's like an adaptation over 15 years.
Yeah, we have a co-host, Adam, who's Italian, New Jersey, combat. He's I'm like, Adam, we're right here, bro. Right, but that's how he is in real life. Sorry, Ma, I cut you
No, I
off.
was saying listening to her talk about the learning how to teach in that environment. It's funny because mine was born out of necessity. I started teaching. We had to teach because of COVID. We went virtual.
Mm-hmm.
And what was funny when you were saying, if you would have said teaching social work virtually, you would have said absolutely not. Well, we were told we had to teach the police academy virtually. And I'm like, well, that's not going to work. But you learn how to adapt, you learn how to connect. I will say kudos to you because it is one of the skills that I felt like it was so much harder to teach in the cloud than it was in the classroom. I felt better connected, like you said, with the students. And I learned how to connect, but I don't think I fully mastered it. So it's just very interesting to hear you talk about the different ways that you were trying to make sure that you connected with your student. And it helps that you're able to see assignments as they're doing them and make sure that they're prepared and things like that.
Well, and breakout rooms and like changing it up, always trying to have movement in the classroom. Because let's be, it is hard to teach virtually because you're sitting in, I'm assuming you're home, like people are in their environments. Life is going around. I'm looking, if I'm home, I'm looking around like that dish. And, it's not like you can sometimes step away and you really are trying to step away and have this is your work space. And so it's been something and it never goes away. So boundaries was hard to develop, especially when I teach in a time zone 3 hours different from mine.
Also, yeah.
Yeah.
And the fact that students, especially when they are in practicum, I had students in practicum from the time East Coast to Hawaii. And
oh, wow.
There was a couple of times we would have international students. We don't do that anymore. But imagine getting up at 3:00 in the morning to do a site visit with, another country.
Jeez.
Yeah. And just to put it out there, you said that your university also has slots or openings for military veterans, or what, was it veterans only?
So we were the first school of social work that had a military sub-concentration.
Yeah.
And so we really were looking at how to cater to those two things. A, we were portable. So we were the first virtual school and we were portable so that because people often, they might want to continue their education, but if you have to PCS somewhere else and you don't have a choice of when to do that, you could start your education or let's say your spouse could start their education, but then not be able to finish it. And so A, we were portable, and B, we had some amazing minds that were retired military to develop curricula, really tailoring and catering around the needs of military and veterans. And so I've often had various cohorts of students, sometimes, especially when you register together, it's rare to have as many males. Social work is more of a female driven, but out of a class of 10 once, I had 8 combat veteran males in my class.
Wow.
So I had to learn how to teach completely differently because as a social worker, we want to talk about emotions. They're not wanting to talk about emotions. They want me to tell them exactly what they should be doing. And I'm like, no, this is, you got to develop that on your own.
Yeah, it was that.
Give me a checklist.
It's really balancing. They want a checklist. They will thank me years later. They will come back and say, I get now what you were saying. But we would sometimes have to come to grips of I'm not going to tell you tell me what I did wrong. And I'm like, that's not what therapy is.
Yeah.
It's there's a range. There's not one way of doing things. And my way is not the only way. So
also true.
Yeah.
Well, I want to get into it and I don't know the best way to set it up, but could you talk about the other aspect of what you do now and how that came to be with the trauma or how would you describe it from dealing with the schools and the aftermath of school shootings? Could you talk about that? Because you're still a professor, but you're also doing this other.
Correct. So I live in Parkland. I'm a Parklander. Even prior to Parkland, when I was in graduate school, I did coursework around mass violence, responding to crisis and tragedy. It was always something that I don't want to call it an interest, but I wanted to understand what the needs are around supporting individuals who are in crisis. And so back then, it was Oklahoma City bombing. So one of my professors was one of the responders to the Oklahoma City bombing, so I really I went to Washington University in St. Louis, the Brown School of Social Work, which at the time was the #1 school of social work. I had the most amazing professors that were out there doing the work. Some of my tenured professors also, but a lot of the professors that I were drawn to were those that were working in practice and bringing that to life in the classroom. Mm-hmm. So I had that. when I moved to USC, my senior vice dean, my boss was Dr. Marlene Wong, who is a preeminent expert, and I don't use that word lightly, on school crisis. She developed the first crisis teams for LASD Unified 40 years ago. Actually, in August is their 40 year.
Wow.
She was a test dummy for the Secret Service on threat assessment. She's advised 3 presidents and responded to most of the mass violence incidents in schools up until Parkland. And so she would always share in her work. I didn't get to work as closely with her as I do now. I'm actually traveling to see her on Saturday. We're doing a mental health threat assessment training in Hawaii. I was always interested in her work, and when she was doing work, she would share what she was doing, so I could learn through that avenue. When the tragedy happened at Marjory Stoneman Douglas, I had 3 kids. I had moved to Parkland in 2012. So I'd been in Parkland for 6 years at that point. At the time, my 3 children, I had twins that were 9th, and they were in an alternative program at a college, a local college. So they were not on campus that day. But when I say 9th grade, their friends were there, and my friends' kids were there. Because when you move to a community, how do you meet people? I work virtually. So I'm not meeting people via work. I'm meeting people via my children. And so my twins were in 9th grade and my son was in 5th grade on the day of the shooting. And it was Valentine's Day. My son in 5th grade, even though he was very unhappy about it, went to aftercare because I'm a professor. I can't just pick him up at 2:00. We lived within I wasn't going to have him walk home, but I also couldn't go pick him up and stand in a car line of, there's like 1,800 kids or 1,200 kids, something. And almost all of them were car riders. So the car line was like an hour long. So he had asked me, Mom, will you pick me up early because for Valentine's Day? I'm like, sure. And actually, what I did not know at the time is I did the reverse a little bit of where the shooter was and ended. I took my parents. I was hoping that maybe my husband and I could go out for dinner for Valentine's Day. So I took my parents out to a nice lunch at a restaurant called Falafel Bistro, which was in the McDonald's shopping plaza where part of that story took place. I told my son I'd pick him up at 2:20, 2:40, 2:30, sometime between there, because car loop started, people line up an hour before. If you've ever been to Parkland, people are literally in line an hour to 2 hours before, and then like 30 minutes later, it's subsided. So I said, I'll get in at the back of the car line and come in and pick you up. We were driving home down Coral Ridge, which passes the kind of the intersection where the middle and high school, and I saw kids in the street, and I thought, well, that's odd. And then I saw people driving on sidewalks. I didn't know what that was. And there's a bank there. We've had some robberies before at the bank in that complex right there by Walmart. And so I thought maybe that's what it was. And within a couple of minutes, 2 minutes, I was probably 3 minutes at my son's school, and I go to the door and it's locked. There's no one inside. That has never happened. There's always someone to buzz you in. It's a locked door.
Yep.
And I'm looking, nothing. I'm starting to hear sirens, but obviously not who puts that together?
Right.
Yep.
And all of a sudden you see more and more parents coming. And I get a text on my phone, and it was from someone who happened to be also another professor who lived in Orlando, Florida. And I'm the regional director at this time over all students. So I'm an assistant director. I oversee right now all the students across the United States in the virtual academic center during their placement. At the time, we were regionally based. So I had the Southeast. And so someone would always reach out to me if there were a crisis and say, I got the text. Active shooter at a South Florida high school. Do we have any students placed in a school? Because our first response is to our students. If we had a student placed, like, what would I do? I hope you can't hear that very loud thunder. So hopefully,
No, you're good.
Starting to have a storm here. Well, I responded back, no students, my high school. Because at that time, we started getting messages that there was an active situation at the high school. So I was standing with many parents outside the elementary school. Many, like me, had children like that age distance away, and they're trying to reach their own children at MSD. and not getting through, not being able to connect. So, as a social worker, my first thought is, okay, how do I help support? And so I would, was starting the kind of the components of kind of psychological first aid of like, how do you support someone who's, in a crisis? I'm at the same time texting all of my friends, where they are. I texted one of my kids, really good friends. I couldn't get the mom, and I texted the son, and he's like, Lisa, I'm in a closet with my teacher. And then we got an alert to leave because the shooter was not located.
Yeah.
And so I had to leave my fifth grader, who had no phone, by the way, at the time, in a locked building.
Yeah.
I went home, and as I'm driving home, I got a phone call from one of my good friends. The smoke alarm went off in the building and across campus. And so many students began to evacuate as thinking it was a drill. And then obviously when it wasn't a drill, they were told to run. And so people were in different phases. So though there was a group of girls that were my son's age, their friends, that were at my girlfriend's house. And she's like, can you come down here? They're hysterical.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do. And I'm thinking, I'm a social worker, but this is not
This is a lot.
I'm in a reaction myself. And so I go down, and they're all watching the FaceTime lives or whatever was videoed and put out to students. So that was the first indication that this was going to be really bad.
Yeah.
Because I was started counting I'm trying to be calm and whatever. And I'm counting, and I'm telling the girls, I think it's really important that you turn that off, because I know you have a desire to know what's going on, but what you see here, you will always have with you. So I talked to the families about not, having the TV on, because, everybody's streaming this stuff and it's everywhere to be had.
Yeah.
So spend some time, gave a little education to the parents, asked the girls to not watch social media. I did message my boys because I wasn't sure if they were going to get messages. And I just said to my twins that were at the college, and I said, something's happening. I'm sending your grandfather to get you. Please don't watch. They didn't have social media. So I have a very rare family that did not have social media all through high school. I said, please don't go on the internet until we sit down together. My kids don't. They listen to me. If I asked them to do something, they were not the people like, oh, why doesn't my mom want me to go on the internet? They just did, thank goodness, what I said. And I went home. I pulled up every resource that I had about how to speak to children after mass violence. And I sent it to the principal of my son's school at FAU, my school, my principal at Heron Heights Elementary. I sent it to the mayor of the city, Christine Humchofsky, who's now is politics here in the state. And I sent it to my school board representative at about 5:30. So this happened at 2. So probably 3 hours later, I got the notice that I could pick up my son.
It's crazy.
Who picked him up from SWAT. That was experience in and of itself, because they had, full police presence at every school. And picked him up. I made locked eyes with the principal. We didn't talk. Took my child home, spent the night texting with other families who were supporting other families. So I always say the degree of separation when something happens like this is maybe 1.
Yeah.
And so really supporting some of those that were providing support, because I did not have a relationship with anyone at the time that was immediately impacted. I did have a lot of relationship with people who were 1 degree of separation from.
Yeah.
So I was providing support to those who were supporting others. The next day, all the schools were open with the exception of MSD. The district did not close all the schools. And so I knew as a social worker, I wanted my children to feel safe in school, even though I wasn't sure myself, but I know routine and normalcy and that was important. So I sent my other kids to school. They finally came. My other kids took it at least 4 hours to get home because you couldn't get through any roads
Traffic
or whatever.
Yeah.
And I once again said, you're going to go to school. The number, it hadn't been identified yet. It wasn't until families did not learn until middle of the night. I just said, once again, I don't want you to go on the internet, please, don't watch anyone's phones, trust that we will talk about this as a family. And I sent them to school, and I took my youngest late to school. They had a police presence as well as support animals and different things. Of course, that devastated me. I knew it was there to help kids feel comfortable, but the fact that we needed that
Yeah.
was really hard. And the principal pulled me because I walked into the office, walked him in because he was not in the car line. And he said, "Can I talk to you?" And he's like, "I just want to thank you because what you sent is what every teacher in this building shared with, because it gave kind of like a overall script, the Child Traumatic Stress Network. There's so many resources out there that do an amazing job of helping prepare in the, public forum that you could download and have. And I just didn't know, what did the district have? I didn't know. I wasn't related. I didn't know anything about it. I did know that I knew some of the most preeminent experts. So I, sent off Dr. Wong's information and a couple of others in regards to like who they needed here, really knowing that I wasn't in the position at the time to respond because I needed to have my own regulation in that process. So there were a couple other, through funerals and different things that occurred, I would have interaction. And obviously the principal had shared something. The mayor probably had shared something with someone else. And I got a phone call asking if I would facilitate a meeting with the district and the most impacted families, some of the most impacted families.
Understood.
It was asked in a way that was genius because it really made me hard to say no. And obviously I did not.
Yeah.
Really feeling like I didn't know if I had the skill set, or I didn't feel like, I don't know if any would ever feel like you were prepared because there's no training that prepares you for that. And that was I had attended a couple of meetings but that was about a month after the tragedy, maybe three or 4 weeks. I know that a meeting had taken place that did not go well, and they wanted an outside person to come in and facilitate the meeting. That meeting took place. Of course, I felt that was the hardest thing I've ever done, and they will never ask me to do that again. And everyone else in the room said, "We're not going to meet again without you." And that superintendent, and no superintendent yet to this date, has met with the families independently. So I would continue to, especially with those injured families that children were in school, they were meeting regularly to kind of see what the students' needs were. I'm not really good at staying in my lane. So I would go in, facilitate a meeting.
Yeah.
And then I would have all these questions like, okay, what has happened since? Like, what's the plan? I'm always wanting to know, like, I don't want to have a family come back with the same need. Like, we need to be meeting their need.
Right.
And it was after some trial, obviously there's going to be, not everything's going to work. The district had always, intentions of support, but also when you have everyone is already doing a job and then all this on top, the injured family group said, "Can we just have Lisa be our liaison? Because she's the constant here."
So collectively they requested you. Okay.
And then collectively the families whose loved ones were murdered said, "Yeah, well, we want her too." So that's how I ended up facilitating the support for both groups. Now, I was a optional resource, so it wasn't something that it was required. I basically set it up that I wanted to be a resource for the families and a confidential resource. And so set it up in a kind of a clinical, they signed that they would work with me, but I signed that I would confidentially, unless they asked me otherwise, to keep everything that happened in our session confidential. So like when I emailed everyone, the district was not included. So I ended up becoming the single point of contact, which is the first role of its kind where families had a single point of contact and the district had a single point of contact for information to go out.
It really, because that to me just seems like the way it should be, instead of having, multiple families, that's already awful, but instead of having each family have to deal with the district in their own way.
They didn't know where to go. And then if I didn't know what to do, then they were calling multiple people instead of, and they're in crisis and in trauma and in grief and all of these things. So, and I, just as I did when I came in, with any job, is like, these are the options that I can do.
Yeah.
I learned very early on, I had to have my own emotional control. And that was one of the first things, especially families whose loved ones were murdered. They said, "This is tough work. If you are going to be emotional, this is not, they've already had people who tried to support them and be emotional. And that was not, we don't want to help support you.
That's a good point.
And they also had some negative experience in regards to communication and some other things. So it was, I had to come from a perspective is I'm going to listen. I'm going to learn. I learned you can't ask someone who is grieving and in full-on trauma and grief and crisis. They don't know exactly what they need. So asking them was not going to be what was helpful. So I would take every situation as kind of a place to where the tenets of psychological first aid is you're listening, you're protecting, and you're connecting. And so I was looking at, okay, what are all the options that I have? And I would give them a menu of resources not resources, options. So for example, after a tragedy, like so many people reach out and they want to do something. They want to have, so letters and blankets and art and all of these things. And so they come to me. I mean, we're talking something that would fill this entire room that I'm in of items. And so I would have these things that would be meant for their family. And I would ask them, like, I have these things. Here are the options. A, do you want them? Or B, should I donate them to the Historical Society? B, if you would like them, would you like me to deliver them to your home? Would you like me to meet you at your place of business or in the community if you don't want me to come to your home? Would you want me to send a courier? Do you want me to send it UPS? Yeah. So I would like to think of every option for every situation that would allow them to select how they either wanted it or did not want the what I had, and then each way that they could have, because they didn't get to choose to be in this situation. They have lost all control. And what they do need is to know what is within their realm. And so I've always tried to utilize that. It was a little bit of trial and error and trying to learn on how to best support families because I try to think through what their needs might be, but I might not know everything. So then trying to put out all the components that I think that could be helpful. And then if they needed something else that wasn't on the list, then they would come to me. So that's how I started to develop relationship.
So, sorry.
And trust.
Trust. So is that what got you into school-based trauma, or had you already been doing that?
Because I'd worked in schools and I'd done coursework in school trauma, and then the more I've in academia I've learned, part of a lot of what I've learned now is, through I've always had that interest in school, but I wasn't trained in all the things that I took the Secret Service mental health, the threat assessment after the tragedy. Like I learned that there are other components that, yes, I had exposure to, but I hadn't truly immersed myself in needing to know all those components because, it wasn't something, especially as a non-school board employee, I was an academic, but I learned a lot because I wanted to help support the families in the best way I could. And so I had a trauma background from my clinical, pieces that I had done in my career. I'd always worked with trauma-exposed youth. I mean, you think about hospitals and inner city schools, like that's the host of, some of the challenges. But I've learned a lot more listening and bearing witness to others' stories through this process.
Yeah, and I guess that's what I want to kind of try to culminate here. So you still have the professor hat. You now have the long-term family liaison for the Parkland families. Is there the third hat where you're now in?
So I was a trainer. Yeah. Those probably coincided around the same time, but I was actually doing some of that work already prior to. I really believe in bearing witness to this experience, and I'm very honored that they have opened their homes and their lives and truly their story. And I don't take that lightly because it's difficult. Yeah. It's difficult work, and it's difficult for them to share that much of themselves with me. But watching that, I certainly want to learn from that and to hopefully develop some avenues where if something were to happen again, how to have some of the resources earlier on. Right. But most importantly, how can we look at some of these pieces as avenues of prevention? Yeah. Because, Parkland's probably one of the most preventable tragedies that have ever, it was known in multiple arenas, in school, in law enforcement, and FBI, like really looking at how can we look at some of our practice
Right.
and how do we develop the relationship between what is a necessity on an assessment, even from like, let's say a law enforcement component, for example, behavioral threat assessment. Behavioral threat assessment, you're assessing that moment in time.
Yeah.
But the challenges that led to someone making a threat or coming to the assessment team is that there are some areas of concern. And
No, for sure.
we need to be following and supporting that student, that family, that school to address those, because it is a very fine line between someone who, and same thing with suicide risk assessments, it's a fine line,
No, yeah.
on.
Well, one of the things that you shared with me, we'll use approximately because I know it's changing. And it was something that Michelle touched on as well, but something like approximately there's been 428 schools that had a firearm discharged. Not all of them are I think they're all horrific. But they're not all quite like that. And then something like over 300 and approximately 350,000.
Over 390, 400,000 students have had that exposure in school.
Been exposed to that. That's wild.
So when you're
crazy,
you're thinking about when you hear your school being on lockdown or something happening and doing all the components, students are not thinking, oh, this is just a drill anymore. Because the reality is they're hearing about it more often, and they're hearing about not only that it's happening, but there are murders and injury that have happened over and over again. Yeah. So it's that connection that even if you're not in a school that has experienced a tragedy, you might know someone who has, and that impacts you. It impacts our reality of how we process the world. And actually, at what age were you exposed? Because, our brains, based on different ages, can handle that in different ways. Yeah. And that's where that idea of resilience, of why two people who experience the same tragedy or complexity or difficult experience, and they respond in different ways. Right. It's all about the resources and the protective factors that we have in our life and what our previous exposure to this kind of experience has on how we're going to process and cope.
No, for sure. We have a few minutes and I want to just touch on you pushing out some resources. But before that, Mo, anything you want to follow up with?
Now, I just, first of all, thank you for sharing your perspective, because I think I knew that you had liaisoned with the families. I had no idea how close that was in proximity to your personal world as well. So that's huge. The thing that really stuck out to me is being a cop. We are used to being able to switch from cop mode to maybe mom mode, that kind of thing. But I'd never thought about it from the perspective of a social worker, of switching from mom mode to putting on that social worker hat and the difficulties that come along with that. So it was interesting to hear that part. The families it was solely based on your interaction with the families that made them say, we want Lisa. Was there any pushback from the district or anybody else that egos got in the way or anything, or tried to not recognize the importance of what really needed to happen here?
I believe, and still, I'm 7.5 years and I'm still in this role. I know that there's a understanding and I hope a value. I was asked to speak this year in DC for the Victims' Rights Week. And I had never asked, of course, I'm a social worker. I'm not going to say, tell me if I'm helping you. That's not what I just assume if they have relationship with me. But I also don't believe anytime I do something, and I didn't speak about this for a long time, but several families have come to me and said, Lisa, people need to know what you're doing, because they started talking to other people about what I was doing. And I'd get phone calls randomly from other family members who have experienced tragedy, other communities. So I had reached out and I wanted to let them know, I was asked to do this because I don't believe in surprises. I wanted them to be aware anytime I've ever had that opportunity. But I said, if there's anything that you would like me to include, please let me know. And it was the first time, and this was in April. So they sent me this stuff in March. So it's 7 years of work. And some of the feedback that I received, I ugly cried for a while as I read it, because it was the first time that I ever really had an opportunity I didn't ask for feedback about me. I just asked for feedback about what they would want families to know and whatever. But some of the feedback that they provided, really, it validated that some of the approaches that I took in this work, because I was kind of, who do you talk to? I mean, it's not often. I would say I learned this just in this last year. The average person who takes a recovery role within a district, the average span of time that they're in that position is 18 months. Just because the work is difficult. There are areas within, the system. I've always felt it was beneficial that I was an outside person, because I didn't ever have to be concerned about some of my feedback based on, am I going to have a job?
Right.
Because that wasn't what this was about.
Yeah.
So I always think that it's a blessing,
For sure.
and I was, and also I was in the community and could have a little bit of an understanding of the impact for this. But it was a really eye-opening, and it was an amazing experience to have an opportunity to talk to advocates from, our government, but across all, because they streamed it within all the groups across the country, and answer questions and have that opportunity. But I learned so much just from the families that I serve. And that is, it's not a one-way relationship. All relationships are, and I've learned so much from them, and I've taken their lead, to be honest, in what some of those needs are. So I can come up with a list of, people are like, how did you know? And I'm like, because I watch, I listen to what is said and what is unsaid, what are the, what can't be spoken. They told me exactly, if you listen hard enough and with true radical listening, it really has been one of the hardest things I've had to do as a professional, but definitely something that I'm honored to do, and now feel called to hopefully make a difference for others.
I mean, it's one of those things where we talked to Michelle about it, where there's no training for national press conferences, speaking in front of Congress and all this stuff. You just kind of do your best. But the things that you're saying to me just make sense, but you're telling us that this is not how things have been done in the past. And I'm sure there's various ways that it can be done, but it just seems like this is how it should be done. And I'm sad to hear that they had some negative encounters previous to meeting you, but I could only imagine. I mean, God.
How could you not?
Yeah.
Honestly.
Well, that's, who knows, right?
I also think we're in a world where I don't always know the right thing to say.
Right.
No, for sure.
However, I'm always going to say something. I think that is the difference.
Yeah.
As a social worker, I was like, I might not know the right things to say, and I think that happens often. It's like the time element. It's not the intention, but it's like you want to say the right thing. So in trying to find the right thing to say or do, that takes time, planning, and sometimes going through multiple tiers of people. And by then you've missed that opportunity to make that connection.
Right.
No,
and so
sure.
I think that's a lot of times what happens. And we're also in, the world of attorneys and lawyers, and a lot things have changed.
100%.
And so I've always been fortunate that my livelihood is not based on this work. My full-time job. I have a full-time job at the university, so I've never felt. And I'll tell you, even with the walkthroughs, that's never probably happened, and I don't know if it'll ever happen again. That it
was pretty rough.
Walked to, hundreds.
Yeah.
I think I asked the state attorney's office how many hours we spent in that building. It was about 200 hours over all of the walkthroughs that took place. It was originally families never wanted anyone to walk through that. We walked the families through as an opportunity to be either in an area where they were injured to process, or to be where their loved one took their last moments. And it was after that some of the families decided, people need to learn from this. So I'm not a decision maker. I'm just there to help support as we did kind of all those walkthroughs. But even in that, and when the higher up of level of individual that needed to walk through that building, the more other people had feedback and like how we needed to handle. And there was not one person up, including our final big walkthrough, where I said, I will stand for what I think is best for the families, even if it wasn't an popular opinion.
I think that's
because they deserve that,
Yeah.
regardless of all things.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter if you're, the president,
Yeah.
Like there is nothing that I won't say. People are like, Lisa, you can't control everything. And I was like, well, I can give my opinion though.
Yeah.
So
100%.
I will always give and I try to take my opinion out of it and know I take a historical grouping of what families have asked for and said, I always bring it back to them to make the final decision. But I do think I will always support what I know that they have asked for and what they need to be able to experience the most difficult thing that has ever happened.
Yeah.
And to re-experience it time and time again. I'm always going to look out for what I think is going to help support them the best.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Lisa, I appreciate you. Mo, anything to wrap up?
Again, thank you, Lisa. You're just a wealth of information, and I think it offers a really unique perspective. And as law enforcement officers, we will say a lot of times that we wear a social worker hat, but we really don't. So thank you.
Not like what she's talking about. No, for sure.
Well, but I do think it's a good relationship to start building even
100%.
more. I know that that's, moving forward, but it does take removing the silos between each of the individual groups to how do we address this holistically to maybe make some changes and to have some impacts for everyone involved.
Absolutely.
Not just from a prevention standpoint, but there's a lot that I was able to witness from the law enforcement perspective of how difficult that process is for them weeks and years later.
Yeah.
And the support's needed. I think we need to cross more, have more integration, and learn from one another.
For sure.
Thank you very much.